Transitioning from where we've been to kind of working our way towards talking about the front end, right? So can I get everybody's attention for a few minutes just up here? So we're kind of transitioning from where we've been talking about the back end and working with Node and Express to this week we're starting to transition and talk about the front end, which is basically where we're going to spend the rest of the course, is really talking about how do we implement the front end of this application that we've started to build the back end for. Let me scroll down, looking at the calendar. Okay, so we're here right around November. So one of the reasons that we want to talk about the specific topic for today, partly is to get things deployed, getting things out there, is as kind of a bridge to getting to our front end, because we'll need it kind of out there so our front end can use it, if that makes sense. We'll want it out on the internet where anybody can get access to it, so that your application, which will actually be a separate project, our front end is going to be a completely separate project, we need that to connect. Everybody good with that? So it's part of why we're doing that now. This is something that I've kind of tried to figure out where it fits in, and this is just kind of where it's landed. So that's the kind of topic for today. In terms of labs, hopefully you've already finished 5.2, 5.3. We'll be going over today, and that is due by the end of the day. Good news is 5.3 is very short. Shouldn't take you much time to complete. And I think at least one person already has. So if I go take a look at my notes here, because I've got a few notes about what to talk about today. So we want to talk a little bit about, basically we've got three kind of objectives today. Is get our APIs deployed to Heroku. I want to talk about some additional middleware that you might want to get installed. Actually, I want you to get installed. Oftentimes we want to use with production and maybe isn't so useful for development purposes. So oftentimes we may even disable that and not have it turned on in development, but we might want it in production or vice versa. Okay? So we're going to talk about a few of those. There's just 4 in there I want to talk about in there, so it's really easy to install. And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about best practices and go over some of the stuff we kind of talked about already and what some of those kind of procedures are in that kind of 12 types of that. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. So just the general definition, you hear me say the kind of the term of deployment or deploy. We use that in the industry to talk about the process of getting your application out there. Right, so getting it into customers' hands. Whatever you do to do that process is considered deployment. So oftentimes for us, that just means upload the files to the server. Upload them to what we would say is the production environment, and then they're visible out there. It can also be things like, hey, if you were shipping your software out on CDs, then that could be your deployment process. Or if it's stuff that you're installing on Android phones, you might have your deployment process as part of installing that on the phone and et cetera, and doing whatever setup you need to do, or configuration, et cetera. Okay? So that's generally what we're talking about. We're taking our software, our apps, APIs, getting them released to the masses. Oftentimes when we're deploying, we actually talk about different environments. So like a development environment, a UAT environment, and a production environment. Okay. So oftentimes we have more than one place where we're deploying to, and we have to kind of manage what's out there. So development generally is the first place your code goes. That's its own kind of server, its own kind of database usually. And that's just where you do testing. That's where, okay, here's the latest thing that we've done. Testers and QAs and BAs can maybe go look at it and just see what's happening, but it's going to be the least stable, right? In terms of the environments, it's where cutting edge code goes, but it's going to have the most bugs. Does that make sense? From there, once some of the bugs and stuff get ironed out, and once we want QA and business analysts to have a serious look at it, we typically promote that over to something called UAT, short for user acceptance testing. So we may have a UAT environment where the software gets kind of fully tested. Okay. They'll work through those, file any bugs, we'll fix any bugs until that gets done. Once we're happy with that, we promote it to something called production, okay? And production is where this code is actually live. Now, for our purposes in this class, we're only going to set up one environment. If you wanted to set up multiple environments, you just set those up as, say, different applications on Heroku, for instance. And so they would just have a different domain. Is that cool? So that is something we can do, and it happens in real time usually, but we're really just working with one environment for this case. So I want to make sure I mention that. So I think some of you have already started it. I want you to kind of pull up 5.3 if you haven't yet. Lab 5.3. And so that's what I want you working on at the moment. Once people kind of finish that, we'll talk about some of the middleware. So let me know when you guys get down to step 10, and we'll talk about some of that. So just in overall, there's a lot of different ways to push your Heroku apps out, and this is, sorry, your Node applications out. This is kind of, we're looking at the first, if you're looking at the first page, you may have already seen this. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. Okay, get everybody's attention. So there's a bunch of different ways to actually get your applications out there. There's a bunch of different ways to do this deployment process. In first semester, you're probably introduced to doing things with FTP, right? Like upload the server to FTP, and that's how we set it up. I think our students, we've gone ahead and put things up on Heroku to get some experience with that. So that's oftentimes where you might start, right? And you also may have heard the term AWS, Amazon Web Services. So that happens a lot too, where we may push things up to an AWS server ourselves and maybe have to provision instead of the machine. So for instance, if you're doing it with AWS, you might set up what's called an EC2 system. That's basically a virtual machine that you're renting. And that turns out to be like a good way to host things, but it takes quite a bit to set it up, especially if you have to set up Windows or Linux or whatever the operating system is. So Heroku is what we call a platform as a service, and what it does is provide some very easy to use tools that will set up the AWS, like the virtual machines, for you effectively. And actually your code is actually running on a Linux, it actually runs on Linux typically, and is actually shared by a bunch of other applications running on that same machine, if that makes sense. So it's going to be very lightweight, they call them dynamos. But it means that it's very easy to get your code out, and it actually makes it really cheap. I think their current plan, like you can do a bunch of free hosting, which is great, and their free tier is pretty generous. And I think the one that I have running that's paid is like $7 a month, so it's still pretty good, even if they're paid, but they paid here. So that's the kind of thing to put in there. I put a little bit of note on there about what platform as a service means, and that's basically what I just talked about, is that they're providing these services rather than you directly interfacing with the infrastructure and having to set up the Windows machines or do FTP downloads and such like that. It kind of deals with that for you. Cool. So this is a very, very popular tool for doing with Node. It works for deploying applications with Node. It works with actually a lot of different technologies. I think they originally started with Ruby, and I know then there they support PHP, but that's kind of what we're going to do. So you'll kind of walk through the instructions. You'll see basically you create an account, and it's almost as simple as just deploying code that's already in the GitHub. So most of it happens automatically, with the exception of needing to set up like environment variables, okay, which we'll do a little bit different than your, say, your env, but it's the same idea. Okay. All right. So that's it. I'll let you go through this. You're going to start up at step 1. Again, let me know when you get to step 10, and we'll kind of talk through that. Okay. If you get to step 10 early, feel free to take a short break. Mac files. Okay. Yes. And that's really like, so, if you look at stuff and you kind of play around and do some of the middleware. So you created the app already, so then go back up to personal, and you see how there's a whole app to, and that's what then gets you to this. So you see on the right, and so we want the more full. Yep. We've already do that. We haven't. So,
Mr. Smith,
yes.
do you expect us that we'll want to continue using Heroku on our, in our personal lives after class?
Very likely.
Okay, so we'll want to use the personal one.
Yeah. Yeah, very likely.
Okay.
It's a good place to push up your portfolio too. Don't have this, you have to sit there. And so it's that. Get rid of the circle wrap. So, yeah, I
We'll try to do that.
only users deploy is even worse.